And welcome to our fall 2021 iSEE Congress. Topic today is circular food systems, which you can see on your screen. I'm Luis Rodriguez, the Associate Director for Education and Outreach in our Institute for Sustainability, Energy, and the Environment. We refer to it as iSEE for short. This institute was formed in 2013 with a threefold mission: funding and shepherding interdisciplinary research projects that have an immediate and lasting impact on solving global grand challenges related to sustainability, energy, and the environment. Our institute also hopes to lead efforts to make the U of I campus a leading model of sustainability, energy efficiency, environmental friendliness. And we hope to educate and prepare students to be leaders in these fields when they leave our campus. These congresses, bringing together leading national and international scientists, researchers, educators, journalists, and activists who will present the latest in research and community inspired actions for global scale grand challenges. And so we fulfill with these congresses two of our missions: discussing the latest and cutting edge research and providing an educational opportunities for our students. This is our 8th iSEE Congress. This time it's a series of 1-hour webinar discussions about more sustainable approaches to our food and agricultural systems. A major challenge for food and agriculture in the coming decades is providing a secure and safe and sustainable food, feed, fuel, fiber system for an ever increasing human population. Especially if we challenge ourselves in using practices that are only increasingly and socio-ecologically sustainable and adaptive to climate change while we all the while continue to increase productivity. I'm going to encourage everyone in the web conference here today to feel free to post questions as they occur via Zoom. There's a Q&A function. And we'll take time in the end with our speakers to address as many of those questions as we can. Today we'll discuss true food circularity and how we must include waste reduction from both the food and agricultural production side as well as the consumer side. For now, though, I'll like to introduce today our moderator, my colleague, Carl Bernacchi. Carl is a research and plant physiologist for the USDA Agricultural Research Service, and he's an adjunct professor in plant biology. So Carl, if you don't mind.
Thank you, Luis. And it's my pleasure to be here today to introduce two excellent speakers. So the first speaker today is Professor Brian Rowe. He's the Van Buren Professor in the Department of Agricultural, Environmental, and Developmental Economics at Ohio State University. Professor Rowe attended the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he received a bachelor's degree in agricultural economics and was named as part of the 1990 Truman Scholar class. Professor Rowe received his PhD in agricultural and resource economics at the University of Maryland. Prior to obtaining his position at Ohio State University, Professor Rowe worked on policy issues surrounding food safety and health information disclosure as a staff fellow at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration in Washington, D.C. Professor Rowe has worked broadly in the areas of agricultural and environmental economics, focusing on issues including food waste, agricultural marketing, information policy, farm nutrient management, behavioral economics, and product quality. He also helped form and currently leads the Ohio State Food Waste Collaborative, a collection of researchers, practitioners, and students working together to promote the reduction and redirection of food waste as an integral part of a healthy and sustainable food system. The title of Professor Rowe's presentation is "How Can We Reduce Waste from Agricultural and Food Systems? The Pivotal Role of Consumers." In this presentation, Professor Rowe will review the recommendations for reducing consumer waste of food offered by a recent National Academy study. Please welcome, virtually, Professor Brian Rowe. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. I appreciate that introduction and look forward to sharing this information and the discussion that will follow. All right, so today I'd like to start with providing some motivation for why a consumer focus, given the breadth of the food system, arching from all the way from the field and its precursors to the consumer. I'll then talk about, as Carl mentioned, the National Academy's recommendations and the report. And from within that, I'll share a little bit of my own research on date labeling, which came out as a recommendation, some recommendations for date labeling of foods from this National Academy's report. So focus on consumers. Consumers and households are key to understanding wasted food along the supply chain, the food supply chain. One of my collaborators and our collaborators with our group here at Ohio State is ReFed, Rethinking Food Waste Through Economics and Data. And they have some of the most recent visualizations of the best available data in the food waste space here from 2019 in this image, where the different areas of the circle represent different sources of waste along the food supply chain. As you can see, residential is the dominant portion of wasted food, representing about 37% by volume. And then food service and retail, with its intense consumer focus and touch points, represents yet another large portion of this, so that we have nearly 2/3 of wasted food being either directly or indirectly influenced by consumers, pointing to one key reason why consumers are critical. But if we think about the food supply chain from its beginnings at the farm, through production, through distribution to consumption, what we note here is consumers sit at the very end of this linear chain. And in order for food to actually be consumed, that is, for us to successfully avoid food waste, we're working with essentially a weakest link process or technology. That is, food should not be wasted at the farm level, that it has to not be wasted next at the production and processing level, and then a step forward and yet again, no waste at the distribution and retail level, and then finally at the consumption level, that consumer now working with food that has embedded energy and products and time and effort from the farming, production, and distribution, has to yet again not waste that food at the consumption level to make sure that edible food does get into a human being's stomach as was intended. When economists and operation researchers think about technologies like this, and they think about a single firm trying to optimize such a system, what they quickly realize is that the last person in this link is critical. And in fact, if you were allocating your most skilled workers to any portion of this chain, because of those embedded resources, the most skilled person would be positioned at the end of that chain to make sure that the food is consumed, that is, that the error does not occur. However, our food system, the last position in this, is occupied by consumers. And consumers oftentimes have very heterogeneous or variable motivations, skill sets, attention, being able to be paid to reducing food waste and to make sure that food can be consumed by somebody and make sure those resources are being used properly. And this motivates some of the work I'm involved with the NSF Multi-Scale Recipes Network, a research network recently funded by NSF to try to envision a more circular food system. And as part of that, to think about consumers and their role in being able to reduce food waste. This was also top of mind as the National Academies pulled together a panel to try to develop a national strategy to reduce food waste at the consumer level during 2019, culminating under the leadership of Barbara Schneeman from UC Davis, with myself and several other people part of that panel, a report issued in August 2020, thinking about recommendations for the consumer link within this. The panel, the committee, was given a tasked to draw conclusions about the current state of knowledge by reviewing existing data. Also to then make actionable recommendations for consumers in the wasted food space, and to identify implementation strategies to reduce wasted food at the consumer level. This is quite a task, and some of the conclusions point to the difficulty the panel faced, because there were few efforts to reduce food waste that have been targeted at the consumer level, and those efforts were typically not systematically evaluated. There was a growing literature, but it was spotty, and the evaluations were oftentimes not very thorough. And so that incomplete and limited research on the drivers of food waste at the consumer level did not really support prioritization of which drivers were getting or motivating consumers to waste food or causing consumers to waste food. In fact, to the point where the existing research just on the food waste topic did not really provide a lot of support for widespread adoption of a specific intervention in multiple contexts. And this really hamstrings current efforts to try to derive a national consumer food waste reduction campaign. But the committee did its work and came up with a sequence of 12 different recommendations through 3 major pathways: changing the food environments, which include a number of interesting and innovative recommendations, including trying to embed consumer food waste reduction in industry certification. That is, to encourage those who are certifying sustainability at the processing and retail levels to think about adding in certification criteria that would help those at the processing and certification level to help their consumers reduce their food waste in home. And also thinking about state and local policies, particularly with respect to waste management, because 20% of most landfill space is occupied by wasted food. So anything that you do to think critically about general waste in a state or a local community has outsized effects on wasted food as well. The second bin focused on consumers' motivation, opportunity, and ability, and led to some suggestions about national behavior change campaigns and how those might be amplified through influencers and through curriculum. And finally, to plug the glaring gaps in the data. For example, I think we have really strong data in the space of, say, energy conservation or water conservation or even recycling behavior. That type of data infrastructure just simply does not exist in the wasted food space. And so leveraging and applying research findings and technology to support research and tech development was another key recommendation, all while providing some implementation and ideas for coordination and partnership. Now, one of those key recommendations, the fourth one, in fact, within the rubric of changing the food environment, thinking systematically about how do other points in the supply chain support consumers as those who would aspire to reduce their food waste, really calls on the food industry trade associations, consumer organizations, and other nonprofits to really advocate for federal legislation to harmonize the language and standardize date labels, and then to coordinate efforts to educate the public. While there have been some industry level suggestions and voluntary efforts, there is not yet a federal call to harmonize date labeling language. And that's led us, in partnership with ReFed and others, and some great collaborators here of mine from ReFed and from the departments of food science at Ohio State University, and a former student of mine now at the University of Delaware, to undertake some research specifically at food date labels. The interesting thing about date labels is they're really quite confusing. They're poorly understood. There's not a lot of rigorous policy analysis. There's been a few more studies recently, but there's still much more work to be done here. And biologically, it's also a very interesting realm because, for example, as is being quoted here from NRDC's work, if milk is handled properly, it will still be safe to consume even after the date on most date labels pass for milk. And in fact, ReFed, as they analyze the food waste space, rate standardizing food date labels as one of their most promising avenues for reducing food waste at the national level. If we think about the date labels that exist, we get everything from sell-by labels on something like milk, one-off phrases like better if used by, which is a little bit distinct and not understood by many. You'll get sometimes multiple dates on the same label with different phrases. Best if used by is something that people are trying to rally behind, but it's out there, as is other phrases like best before, leaving a lot of confusion among consumers concerning what do these date labels really mean? Do the words have much meaning? Do the dates have much meaning? And if so, what do they mean? And in fact, as we looked out over the national, a study that we did in 2018, we saw just a potpourri of different date labels in use in the industry. All these different phrases, sometimes dates without words, or even other phrases than these half dozen phrases were in use across a variety of different food areas. Now, there have been efforts to reform date labels at the federal level. Legislation has been introduced several times, including most recently the Food Date Labeling Act of 2019, which was hoping to whittle down this forest of different phrases into two: best if used by, which would indicate a quality date, and then a phrase called used by, which would indicate that the date has some safety implications. USDA FSIS also issued some guidance in 2016 encouraging dates, product date labeling to use best if used by date labels should there only be a quality issue, but they demurred in terms of providing any advice about if a safety issue might be at play. Industry, through FMI and now the Consumer Brands Association, back in 2017 started a process to standardize through a voluntary regulation those two terms as well, best if used by and used by, although the uptake has been spotty at best. There's been some movement, but there's still quite a variety of phrases out there. And even some states have tried to jump in, but truly this needs to be harmonized at the federal level. What we try to do is to understand what role date labels might play in the behavior of consumers when they come to that point of determining whether they might discard a product, and looking at the role of different phrases, if education campaign might help, and what other avenues might exist to reduce consumer food waste related to date labels. We used a within subject online design, along with a couple other ones, but I'll focus on this here today. And you can see kind of an example of some of the stimuli that our online patrons saw here, using both cereal and lettuce and some meats, about 6 different product categories total, where they would see different date phrases and indeed different dates on those, and being asked whether they would keep the product, discard the product, or if they weren't sure, depending on obviously the day that they saw this. What we found from this was rather interesting. For example, here we look at their intended discard of a lettuce in a clamshell product. For the phrase sell by, where that date was basically yesterday's date, 1 day past, with no additional education provided, about 40% of the respondents suggested that they would likely discard this product. If you change the phrase to the preferred phrase of best if used by, we saw very little difference in terms of their intended discard. Now, there are a few odd phrases out there like expires on, which do have a small bump in terms of their intended discard. Now, if the respondents first had some education about the meaning of these phrases, which might simulate some type of national education campaign, we do see some movement, but not overwhelming movement in terms of the intended discard. But what we find being the most effective, though, is simply the date itself, moving from 1 day past the date label to being on the date of the date label, reduces the intended discard by about half, regardless of the phrase and pretty much regardless of education. And knowing our food scientists out there, there's probably unlikely that quality degraded by half over the course of one day. And so this begs the question of how are these dates being decided by different processors and packagers? So some of our takeaways on date labeling is that standardizing date label phrases could be a source of improvement in terms of reducing discard of perfectly good products by consumers, though the exact phrase doesn't have an overwhelming impact upon the intended discard from this sample of consumers. There would likely be larger benefits from standardizing that label to one or two phrases. Education campaigns are going to be much more effective if there's only one or two phrases in the world rather than 6, 7, 8 like we see now. But we think the biggest scope for possible improvement is around private firms and those decisions that they're making about the date that they actually print on their products, as we see this as the largest potential source of change in discard, particularly for shelf-stable products where we think that quality degradation is the key concern, and there's unlikely to be any hard and fast reduction in quality that necessitates a particular date being used. And so we really urge future research to try to address the trade-offs that might come as private sector partners think about choosing different dates to be printed on their packages and how that might affect both purchase and discard patterns. But all of this suggests that date labeling can indeed have some impact upon the amount of discard happening among consumers, and that this is a systematic problem that needs addressing, though perhaps not in the exact ways that we're currently envisioning in this conversation.
Thank you very much, Brian, for that excellent presentation. And so now it is my pleasure to introduce Tom Theis, who's a professor of civil materials and environmental engineering and director of the Institute for Environmental Science and Policy at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Professor Theis's areas of expertise include life cycle impact assessment, industrial ecology, and mathematical modeling and systems analysis of environmental processes, environmental policy, pollution prevention, and hazardous waste management. He has published in excess of 150 peer-reviewed articles and is the co-author of the text Sustainability, a Comprehensive Foundation. Professor Theis is a past member of the US EPA Congressionally Chartered Science Advisory Board, or SAB. Among his assignments while in the SAB were chair of the Review Committee on Multimedia, Multi-Pathway, Multi-Receptor Exposures and Risk Assessment Model, known as 3MRA. He was the chair of the Scientific and Technological Achievement Award Committee and co-chair of the Integrated Nitrogen Committee, where he helped to develop the SAB report on reactive nitrogen in the United States, an analysis of inputs, flows, consequences, and management options. This afternoon, Professor Theis will be presenting on food systems and circularity, where he will explore research and opportunities within the context of the circular economy, drawing upon recent experience in the NSF-sponsored workshop, World Without Waste. Without further ado, please virtually welcome Professor Tom Theis.
Thank you for that introduction, Carl. I want to talk about waste from the point of view of closing resource loops and a little bit of adjusting diets. Here's a snapshot of the United States food system. It is among the most complex systems devised by humans. It is also a thermodynamically open system, mostly privately owned with considerable government involvement, and is a significant part of the US economy. The food system is embedded within a kind of system of systems intersecting with environmental, economic, and social systems, and their subsystems as well. I should say I didn't draw this thing. It's much too complicated for me to understand. Another way to look at it is as envisioned as a network comprised of various nodes and connections. This is sometimes referred to as an integrated life cycle approach. These boxes represent stages in the production, transformation, consumption, waste management, and impacts of food. Black arrows are transfers of material, energy, and information. Red and green distinguish production from consumption stages, while orange contains downstream human and ecosystem impacts. The blue box represents government regulatory actions and oversight. So there's a lot of stuff going on in the US food system. One of the things that in the industrial ecology area, which I work in, that we try to track is the waste to product mass ratio. It's a kind of a material cost benefit metric. Here we see how agriculture stacks up against other industrial activities. So for example, automobiles, the waste to product ratio is around 2 or 3 to 1. That is, for every, let's say, kilogram of automobile that rolls off the assembly line, about 2 to 3 kilograms of waste is created and has to be managed. That's at the factory gate. If we include consumer use, it balloons to around 10 to 1, all that gasoline that we put through them, oil, tires, etc. So if we get on the list, you can see different common industries and their waste to product ratios. Logic memory chips are very large ratios up to, actually, we've seen it as high as 2,000 to 1. Open agriculture, as it's practiced today, has a waste to product ratio of about 0.3 to 1. Not bad, unless you include soil losses, then it balloons to 30 to 1. So this gives a kind of a perspective on where we can place agriculture as an industrial activity. A couple of years ago, the World Bank looked into what they termed the invisible water crisis, the proliferation of reactive nitrogen in the environment. Reactive nitrogen is all chemical forms of nitrogen except diatomic nitrogen. And they called it the largest global externality. So let's look at that for just a minute or two. Why do we need it? Well, it's an obligate nutrient for a human, frankly, all life. Yet reactive nitrogen, which I abbreviate as N sub R, is not naturally abundant on the earth. It is in the atmosphere, but not on the land and in the soil. Our requirement is about 12 grams per day per person. That magnifies to about 1.4 teragrams per year in the US. A teragram is 1 million metric tons, and about 28 teragrams for the world. So it's not naturally abundant, but a little over 100 years ago, Haber and Bosch put together a system for mining nitrogen from the atmosphere at a relatively low cost. This, we don't have to go through the Haber-Bosch process, I don't think in this. This ushered in what today is often termed chemical or maybe biochemical farming. On the left hand of this particular slide, you see advances in agricultural technology have doubled yields over the past 40 years. But on the right, open farming systems also yield considerable wastes. For example, agriculture's contribution to the release of reactive nitrogen in the US is over 50%, the green shaded areas. And in that particular graph, BNF stands for biological nitrogen fixation. Now, let's look a little more closely at this. In comparison to pre-industrial times, human activities have increased reactive nitrogen in the US environment almost tenfold. The upper left, the paleo, let's call it reactive nitrogen, about 4 teragrams of nitrogen per year cycles through the atmosphere and the biosphere. Today, that's closer to 30 or 31 teragrams per year. So it's almost a tenfold increase. If we were to speculate on a warmer future, I'm just pinning it at 2 degrees Fahrenheit, although it's probably going to go higher than that. We will see increases in wildfires. We're already seeing those, aren't we? And that will contribute nearly 3 times as much reactive nitrogen to the environment in comparison with today. So it's a big shift in the cycling of nitrogen on the Earth. So Brian just talked about consumers. Let me just weigh in on this for a second. We're the ones who eat food and use other agricultural products. So here's a bit of a snapshot. As Brian pointed out, there's a lot of post-field food wastage. Our nitrogen consumption in our diet is about 19 grams per person per day. Remember, we only need about 12. A lot of obesity and quite a bit of diabetes in our population. So if we compare what we eat today to around 50 years ago, there have been a few changes. Back then and now, we've been over-consuming meat and eggs and under-consuming fruits and vegetables. But if you look closely, we have moved the needle a bit as we consume more grains, vegetables, and fruit today, as some consumers have begun to shift their diets towards vegetarian and vegan. So these shifts may be slow, but they are happening. This is also reflected a bit by the Healthy Eating Index. Although we have a way to go, it is possible for human diets to shift over time. Here's a takeaway for you. Were we to eat to recommended guidelines, reactive nitrogen input to the environment from agricultural activities would decline by about 40%. Water requirements for agriculture would decline by about 30%. And probably diet-related diseases would also decline. So there's a lot of room here for improvement. Finally, I want to say a few things about urban agriculture. As I pointed out earlier, large-scale agriculture operates as an open system in which large quantities of chemicals are imported and waste are exported to the environment. In contrast, urban systems operate under a very different set of constraints, and they have to maintain profitability, focus on closing life cycle loops, recycling and reusing waste and nutrients, and innovating in ways that large-scale agriculture mostly can't. So for example, yields have to be much higher. If we do a little comparison here, the California Central Valley, which is a very fertile area for our agricultural land, yields are between around 3 and 10 kilograms per square meter, depending upon the crop that's being grown. Urban indoor and vertical vegetable farms, on the other hand, all have yields in excess of 50 kilograms per square meter, some considerably in excess of that. Some of this is proven, older, I guess you'd say, technology like greenhouses. This is a greenhouse farm, if you will, in the Netherlands, large scale, I would say. But a lot of it is more innovative. Typically, urban farms are more compact and make use of different farming methods. For example, here we have loofah farms operation in Montreal, which uses hydroponic technology. No soil losses because there is no soil to lose. And this is in Montreal, of all places. I'm sure many of you have heard of Gotham Green's urban farms, mostly around New York City, but they have a location in Southeast Chicago as well. Here's another one. This is Arrow Farms in Newark, New Jersey. They cite their yield as over 1,300 kilograms per square meter per year. And they do this by having multiple cropping cycles in a given period of time. And closer to home, the Chicago plant here in Chicago co-locates compatible industries and combines principles of industrial symbiosis, where the waste of one business becomes input to others, with closed loop operation or nearly closed loop operation. And they plan to produce biogas to drive the whole system. They use aquaponic technology, which is hydroponics coupled to fish farming. And you can go and have a meal there if you like. So I'm going to leave you with this takeaway. There are lots of co-benefits for urban agriculture, but also lots of barriers. I don't have time to go into all of these, but let me just highlight a few of them. Near the top of the list is these systems generally require less water per yield than rural farms do. On the other hand, they do require water. It's a burden on municipal supplies, must tap into existing lines or develop their own water supply and pay the going rates. They can reduce the embodied energy of material inputs of transport and packaging. However, material supply and crop distribution can contribute to local congestion, lots of truck traffic. They can help to alleviate food deserts, perhaps, generate opportunities for better nutrition. However, we have to deal with a legacy problem, accumulated toxins, for example, lead, which is in almost all urban systems, and that has to be managed somehow. As I mentioned, closes the life cycle loop. Organic waste products are composted and recycled, and nutrients are recycled as well. However, competition for land and space in urban areas can be intense, so prices for land tend to be quite a bit higher than rural areas. So we're going to leave it at that. I guess we're going to have, this is a panel, so we'll have some questions, I guess, and chit chat back and forth. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to thank both speakers for excellent presentations. And at this point, I would like to open up the floor for questions. And so there is a Q&A link at the bottom of the screen. So the first question is from Victoria Finkenstadt. Are there efforts to balance food safety versus product quality in consumer education? And how do companies manage that risk?
Yeah, this is one of the pressures in this space. We've got health and nutrition, we've got safety, and we've got waste, all sometimes having interface and tension within and across the supply chain. Within the date labeling world, that tension will appear through these two phrases that are oftentimes being promoted in policies. There's one that refers to items where quality is the issue, and there's very limited or no real biological threat from safety. So shelf-stable products and things like that, there's difficult to kind of justify a strong reason for a 3-month date horizon on certain goods. So, but then we have products that have biological activity and typically don't go through a kill step before being consumed. Think of deli meats, soft cheeses, where you might have things like listeria that might run amok. And there, a different phrase likely needs to apply. And the big issue here, which really hasn't been, I think, thought through all the way, is those education campaigns are going to have to be fairly nuanced given the demands here, right? Because you're going to have one set of phrases where you say, don't worry about the date, not a big deal. It's more about the peak freshness. But if this other phrase appears, watch out. There could be some safety implications. And firms will probably want to shy away from that type of language because that might have some type of liability implications. And deciding which products get that different phrase might be very dicey in a commercial space as well. So harmonizing labels would be quite useful, but there are some safety implications which will have to be thought through, particularly on the consumer education side and setting up the bins into which different products go among those two phrases.
Question from Annie Brunton. Do you have any data to indicate that date labels are a primary source of discard compared with other reasons, or is it a hypothesis?
Yeah, so as I responded in here, part of this reflects on the kind of nascent state of data collection and the food waste space, particularly at the consumer level. Unlike energy, which is measured at the meter and very precisely measured, or our water bills, which have very precise measurement units, single place. Food waste for consumers can occur at any number of food service establishments, in the home, different people in the home. Its measurement is a bit of a conundrum, and we're working on ways to improve that. But that's led to it being very difficult to really pinpoint a lot of things. Now, the group that's done this the best has been out of the United Kingdom, a group that goes by the acronym WRAP, W-R-A-P, wasted, I forget what it stands for, but they've done considerable work over the past decade, and their indications are that date labels in their studies are a big mover in terms of the consumer food waste space, and others have drawn that. I think we need more data to be able to pin that down, but it does present one logical point of attack to deal with consumer wasted food that in lieu of other better data, it seems like a logical place, one logical place to start.
Again, I'd like to encourage the participants to continue putting questions into the Q&A. I have a question in listening to both of your presentations. One thing, I guess two questions, struck me, and one of them has to do with defining what waste is. And so during Tom's presentation, you put a slide up talking about issues related to obesity and disease and diabetes. And then during Brian's presentation, there was this idea that anything that's not consumed is wasted. And I guess that drew me to wonder, what exactly is waste? And so I'm a pretty healthy individual, and if I see this last piece of food on my plate, and I decide I don't want to waste that, I'm going to eat it. Is that really not wasting the food when it could lead to these types of health issues? And is it potentially just too complex to really make that differentiation?
That's a good question. My simple answer is that waste is something nobody wants. But I think it's more complex than that. We actually had a workshop on this last May on a world without waste. And there are many points of view expressed in that workshop. So I'm not on very firm ground by defining it that particular way. But I would say this, that it's wasted if it goes to a landfill, period. It's not wasted if it goes to the sewer system and is treated as part of wastewater, a component of wastewater. That's turned into a usable material, which can be recycled and usually is recycled to farms or other gardens and that sort of thing. Now, it's still a problem, don't get me wrong. We do waste a lot of food. I just want to draw a simple distinction about how to define it. Brian?
Yeah, even within the narrow realm of food waste, I think somebody did a count, and there's, I think it ranges into the hundreds, if not at least the dozens of different definitions that have appeared in print, showing you the enormity of this task. For me, what I like to think about is if we would sit down and think about the slate of deliverables that consumers would want, and then think about what is the cost minimizing or resource minimizing processes and input usages that get us that set of deliverables, allowing for some stochasticity, allowing for some noise in that process as kind of a best practices frontier. To me, that gives us a frontier or a threshold for defining waste. So the fact that somebody had intended a trailer full of Twinkies to be eaten. Somebody may have wanted those Twinkies, but if they were turned over and squished, but then somehow you use a considerable amount of resources to extract those and put those into compost, which then had to be moved to be put upon land to be used as a soil amendment, doesn't seem like the cost minimizing way to allocate your resources to meet that consumer demand. So for me, and I haven't yet seen this definition of waste fully fleshed out in the literature. I've been meeting with all my free time to try to write a paper, something like this, to really define that. I think, to me, that is the pathway forward, is to have a basically an analytical framework that kind of shows that practices frontier in the face of stochasticity that gets consumer demands met in a resource optimal way.
So excellent talks, Tom and Brian. I just had a couple, question maybe for each of you. I was wondering, Tom, I mean, this indoor agriculture, of course, sounds very promising, closed loop and all of that, but wouldn't address the bulk of our problems, which are caused by row crop agriculture needed for livestock feed that is really, cannot be converted to indoor agriculture. So I was wondering what your thoughts might be on that. And then Brian, for you, how much of, so date labels sort of once part of the issue, but then what about things like portion size and, which kind of get to also Carl's question about, the incentives for why large portions are sold but cannot be eaten and contribute to this, or so maybe just a couple of thoughts that.
Let me give a short answer to your question about indoor farming for animals. The simple solution is stop eating animals, period. And we do see a little bit of evidence that that's happening. Not a lot, not yet anyway. Let me just leave it at that. Brian?
Yeah, so a lot of my recent work has been working with nutritionists, because they're the ones who've been thinking about understanding consumer habits with respect to, bringing food home, preparing it, and then eating just enough to make sure that they're dealing with their diabetes or obesity and things like this. And portion size is the holy grail among nutritionists, and I would argue should become one of the parts of the holy grail for addressing consumer food waste as well. Supporting consumers in making appropriate choices about portion sizes, I think, is a critical step and an elegant solution, because it can reduce temptation in terms of overeating. And then the portion is fully consumed, getting rid of plate waste, which is one of the least dealt with segments of waste. Very little is good is done with plate waste typically, whereas the waste in processing facilities oftentimes, because of the profit motivation, find another use. So I think portion size is just a critical element to this that nutritionists have been thinking a lot about, and now I think folks in food waste need to think quite a bit about as well.
So we have a few more questions, and I'll start with a question that has already been answered via text, but this is from Amelia Gertu. Is there a drive to put emissions, greenhouse gas or carbon dioxide equivalent, on food labels to provide consumers a sense of emissions in production, processing, transportation, refrigeration, and packaging? And I suspect that this deals with a completely different side of waste that we've been talking about, but still nevertheless important.
Yeah, I don't track that space incredibly closely, but I think there have been certifiers out there. I mean, there have been environmental and eco labels for decades upon decades. And I think that space has probably evolved more to using LCA metrics. I don't know a lot of the specifics there. Madhu or Tom, maybe you guys even know more in that space in the recent past. So I'll just stop there and say I think we're arcing towards that, but I don't see any dominant certifier or labeling scheme out there right now.
We have methods of estimating, I guess I would say, CO2 equivalents from production and processing and even distribution of food, but there's no requirement for it, which would have to happen either voluntarily maybe companies could just take this on and say, look at us, we're a leg up on labeling. But until that happens, I don't see it becoming very widespread.
Okay, we have a question from Victoria Feigenstadt again. Could you speculate on the socio-political environment that would make demand for public infrastructure, e.g. composting, recycling, a possibility and worth the cost? And this again is for either of you and both of you.
I think you see some of that in California with their, I think you've seen a lot of activity in the space of composting due to state level goals and mandates to reduce emissions. So I do think you see a crucible of that in California, where those large level goals have then kind of worked their way down through the system, and through LCA analysis have pointed to improving the recycling and the composting infrastructure. It may have hit some bottlenecks, which might be instructive should these be adopted elsewhere or even nationally, but I'd look there. Even during the past administration, there were food waste reduction initiatives. I think waste reduction is perhaps one of the few things that has been fairly bipartisan. All those bills in Congress that have not been passed but have been introduced are typically done on a bipartisan basis. So this is not a terribly partisan area. As soon as you start talking about greenhouse gas emissions, then it does arc into more partisan territory, but just waste reduction seems to be fairly bipartisan.
Yeah, let me say this also, that I talked a little bit about urban agriculture. It's not a sure thing. The costs are considerably more than they are in rural systems. And there are a lot of constraints that are very hard to overcome. They do need water, especially hydroponic systems, maybe not as much per pound of produce compared to rural systems. So I'm not sure how this is going to actually turn out. There is a lot of innovation going on in this space, however, and I think that's important to note. I would also turn the question around. While urban farms may or may not be viable in the long term, how much longer do you think we can maintain yields from the Central Valley of California going forward? Climate change is happening, and they do have droughts, very serious ones, and they use a lot of water. So I'm not sure that that's the right answer either to long range waste reduction in agriculture.
So I see Brian is typing the answer to a question, but if it's okay, I'll just go ahead and ask it. Is there a sense of differences in consumer waste as a function of socioeconomic status? Are there differences? And this question was asked by Annie Brunton.
Yeah, I think in the general world of pollution, there's this idea of the Kuznets curve, where pollution will go up as socioeconomic status goes up across countries, but then as incomes go up even further, pollution will perhaps go down on a per person basis. But for solid waste, typically that is not the case. Solid waste typically continues to go up with incomes. In the even narrower world of food waste, again, the data doesn't help us much here because we don't have great data sources. But interestingly, we have some very detailed data over a long period of time from China during its massive 20-year expansion from early 1990s through the late 2000s. And we found there that the level of food being wasted in households declined by about 20% on a per person basis over a period of time where these household panelists' incomes basically triple. So it does go against the general narrative that higher incomes drive higher wasted food. But there still is, perhaps in developed countries, more of a sense that higher incomes will lead to higher food waste.
Thank you. We have a question from Anya Connect. From a systems perspective, what would you say is the best starting point to addressing waste? Would it be from a business or from an individual consumer? And that again could be for both of you.
Well, Most businesses are not in the business of educating consumers. What we're seeing to some extent now is consumers are simply deciding they're getting educated and they're shifting their dietary preferences accordingly. And businesses will follow that for sure. There's certainly a role for regulation in this, I would say, but that's a more complicated procedure.
Yeah, the National Academies panel noted that it does have to be a systems level response. You can shame and guilt consumers all you want, but even the most dedicated folks sometimes just can't find the right information, the right portion sizes, the right package sizes, the ability to compost those items that they don't waste. And so there needs to be systems responses. And so again, your waste hauling infrastructure, about a quarter of municipalities have pay as you throw as part of their waste management system. Even expanding that could have massive system-wide implications as that works its way through the system to make people rethink every part of that.
Thank you. And so I suppose there are no other questions coming in, but I do have one that I would like to ask, and it has to do with the labeling and the trusting consumers. And so I remember years ago, and I certainly do not like Budweiser, but they had this big campaign where they put the born on date, you know, and didn't work for me advertising wise. But how much can we trust, let's say, instead of putting expiration dates on food, just putting on dates when the food was packaged or harvested and leaving it to the consumer to make the decisions? Or is that asking too much of the consumer or putting too many people at risk?
So I think with certain categories of food, I think it would be fine, or non-perishables. In fact, even with milk, which is pasteurized, and the only risk is really cross-contamination, we actually did an experiment where we removed the dates altogether. And we found that certain consumers found 40-day-old milk perfectly fine and something that after they sniffed it, they would probably drink and use in their own home. But if you put the date on and show them it was 40 days out, they would pretty much knee-jerk response, oh, I'm going to dump this out. So certain classes of foods, I think, where there aren't biological hazards, pasteurized foods, et cetera, I think we can trust consumers more.
Okay, with that, I would like to thank you both personally for great presentations and a wonderful discussion on an area that I'm not terribly familiar with, but research-wise, but certainly in my own personal behaviors. And so I've learned a tremendous amount from the both of you. At this point, I'd like to turn it back over to Luis, who will conclude this seminar.
Thank you so much, Brian and Tom. What a great discussion. Thanks to the audience for some wonderful questions. We know this is only a conversation and it'll continue. So I hope this is of interest to so many of us, and I think that's probably very likely to be true. With that in mind, however, notice the new slide. We have another iSEE Congress session coming up. It'll be about turning agricultural wastes into usable products, and is scheduled for 12 noon, Tuesday, November 9th. It's only 6 days from now, and we hope to see you all then. Registration's open. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thanks again for joining.